Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
Welcome to the Hollywood or History Podcast, a podcast to help social studies teachers and teacher educators use film effectively in their classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Roberts, and in each episode, we talk with a volume editor and lesson plan developer to determine the accuracy of their favorite films.
Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hollywood or History Podcast. This podcast is about war films. I'm here today with Dr. Mark Pearcy, who is going to talk more about his book, as well as some lesson plans he wrote about Saving Private Ryan and Glory. Mark, welcome to the podcast. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks for having me here. I am a professor of teacher education at Rider University. Rider is a liberal arts college, pretty much on the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. We're about halfway between Trenton and Princeton. About 4,400 kids. I have been there now for 13 years. I teach primarily methods classes to undergraduates. I supervise student teachers in the field. I do a little bit of everything. I also host a podcast there. It's called Pod Save the Teachers. That's the official podcast of the College of Education and Human Services. I've been doing that for a couple of years as well. Prior to coming to Rider, I was a high school teacher in Florida for 19 years in public high schools. And I always joke with people that a large part of my job now is to make sure that no one ever moves to Florida again to be a teacher. This is an excellent area of the world in which to be a teacher. I graduated from the University of Florida, which I feel compelled to mention since I know you're a Georgia fan.
Right.
And I think this is a compelling argument for how people can come together despite those divisions. In our polarized time, we can still find common ground over books about movies.
I agree. And if a Georgia grad and a Florida grad can work together, then, there's hope for the world, I guess.
Absolutely.
Well, welcome. We're happy to have you. So just for the audience, so we've done a few podcasts already, and in the book series, I think anyone that's listening to the program continuously knows that the vast majority of the books are edited by someone or several people, and they generally ask their others to write the lesson plans for the book. It's also not very narrative. We do have an introduction that introduces the lessons in each chapter, but the vast majority of the book are just basically a series of lesson plans that any teacher can use, step by step, or they can certainly adapt to meet the needs of their own learners. Your book, Mark, though, is a little bit different. It's a solo written, edited volume. You wrote all the chapters, you wrote all the lesson plans, and you also, it's much more narrative than other books in the series, which makes it just a little bit different. So can you kind of talk more about the book, why you selected war films, and maybe even a little bit about how the book looks a little bit different than the other volumes, which I know you've contributed to as well?
Sure. And thank you for the question. I came to the book series. I'd done some chapters with previous books, so I knew what it was about. And when this idea was pitched, I had a sense that I wanted to do something about the way films are used in the classroom. And traditionally in U.S. history, which I probably taught more than anything else, a lot of times they're films about war. I never really thought of myself as a cinephile until kind of recently, and maybe the pandemic helped with that because we got to watch a lot of movies while we were all shut in, and I realized, gosh, I've seen an awful lot of movies, and a lot of these movies I had shown in class. I was a big believer in film media in class because I believed it could be used actively and could be used effectively. So the premise of the book was that if we're going to show movies about war, what are we showing them for? What is the intent, and what are kids taking away from it? And some of the most ubiquitous films, in secondary education are even peripherally connected to war. I told the story in the book that when I was 7 or 8 years old, I think I had to go to the hospital for a time, and my dad got me a book as a gift. And clearly he was not running this by my mother, because he got a book by James Jones, who wrote, From Here to Eternity and The Thin Red Line. And it was a book called World War II. And it was ostensibly a collection of graphic art from World War II. It included a whole section on nose art on bombers and fighter planes, which was frequently scantily clad women. So at 8 years old, I was enthralled by this book. But the title of the book comes from James Jones, where he said, one comes to believe that only the defeated and the dead really hate war. Mm-hmm. And of course, as we know, they don't count. And so what I wanted with this book was not only to be kind of a manual for how to use film effectively in the classroom, but also an exploration of what we do with war films in the classroom and what results we expect to gain by using them.
Right. Yeah, and that's great. And I think it's an outstanding book. It's one of my favorite in the series. And but I just want to let the audience know that it's just a little bit different than the other 9 volumes that we'll discuss during the podcast. And again, it even has like just a slightly different title. So normally the books say Hollywood or History and then something after. But in this case, again, it's The Defeated and the Dead, teaching about war through film. And then at the very bottom, you can see it's a volume in the Hollywood or History series. So, you talked a little bit about why war films, but is there anything else you want to elaborate on about, why are war films important? Obviously, I think, we can all relate back to our secondary teachers showing some of Saving Private Ryan, or, in my case, The Last of Mohegans, which is a war film, or, or not Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that's not a war film, but Sergeant York, which is definitely a war film. So can you talk more about war films, when they're used, how they should be used, and honestly, why they should be used in the secondary social studies classroom?
Well, what's interesting about war films is that frequently, like I think most types of films, when they are shown, the first most superficial reason to show them is to depict something, to depict a historical event of some kind. This would be the argument for showing Titanic. If you wanted to show the ship sinking, that was basically it. Here's what happened to that event. War films, though, carry with them kind of an implicit message that whatever is being shown, there is a value to it, either moral or immoral. And what's really fascinating about the way we use war films is that, generally speaking, we seem to be using them to implicitly endorse whatever that war might have been about. Saving Private Ryan is, now that I've seen it maybe 150 times, I've come around to the idea that it's actually a very subversive anti-war film. But watching it the first time, it clearly is meant to show that the goal of the main characters, the protagonists, was noble and just and admirable. Francois Truffaut kind of famously said that there's no way to make an anti-war film, that by depicting a war and depicting warlike behavior, you are endorsing what's happening, and you are also presenting it as filmic entertainment. The idea of guns going off and bombs going off and bodies flying through the air, that is portrayed as exciting. So I was very interested in the idea that when we show a movie in the classroom, are we doing so that kids will come out of it saying, wow, war is awful, war is terrible, we don't want that to happen? Or are they going to come out saying, God, that was awesome, what a great movie? And do we mind if it's the latter over the former? Particularly in a political community like America, where our history is largely a construct of our political identity. The idea of we were a nation of scrappy underdogs that was born in war, and that the wars we have fought, by and large, according to the dominant narrative, have been just. And I think that the use of films, especially, the ones we tend to rely on heavily, imply a kind of passivity in their receipt, that a kid will watch it and will absorb what the message of the film is and will walk out believing that's what happened. And because film, by its very nature, distorts history, that's something problematic, especially when it comes to something as dramatic and as challenging as war.
Right, and that's interesting too, right? Because we think of like the just wars, as you talk a lot about in your book, World War II, the American Revolution, things like that, and then maybe, and R.I.P. to my dad, he passed away recently, but he was a Vietnam vet, and I've always felt that was not an unjust war, not only to the Vietnamese, which took the brunt of it, but also the American soldier that came back and was not celebrated, perhaps like the ones that came back from World War II, for example. So yeah, and then as a viewer, like when I watch The Last Mohegans, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, that end scene is awesome, right? They're running through the mountains of North Carolina. It's supposed to be New England, but North Carolina, blah, 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 fighting for love and revenge and everything like that. But then, then you watch a movie like Platoon, and you certainly don't walk away saying, wow, that was awesome. So it's interesting.
Every film, I think we all accept, and then I think the series that you edited is kind of, it's buttressed by this understanding that film is never accurate when it comes to history. It has to, filmmakers have to make choices, and they have to elide certain things and cut certain things and minimize certain things. Rather famously in the movie Glory, which is probably the most ubiquitously shown film in American history, one of the main characters is portrayed as, kind of a bumbling misfit because he's a free black man. And he's portrayed as sort of an outlier. Well, when in fact the majority of the people who fought in the 54th Massachusetts were freed blacks from the North. However, that doesn't create the kind of narrative tension that a filmmaker will want, or that a film has to have in order to attract attention and attract interest. So war brings with it a level of excitement, a level of risk, a level of anxiety-inducing tension that makes films go. But what it then does is implicitly says war is fun,
Right.
war is entertainment, and that's problematic. And it's not necessarily bad that it's problematic. It gives kids an opportunity to critically inquire as to what the film is trying to do. But that's not the way films are mostly used, especially when it comes to war. It's just press play and let the kids watch it.
Right, exactly. And that's the whole point, not only of your book, but all the volumes in the series
Mm-hmm.
is really trying to help teachers use film, as you said, effectively. Don't just press play. Don't just use it to like let kids, have 20 minutes off during a sub, with a sub there or whatever. We really
Mm-hmm.
want to make it an impactful teaching tool. And I think again, all the books in the series, all the lesson plans that have been written for the series, help a teacher bring in these historical films and let kids look at them through a different lens. And especially your book being focused on war films, having them take a much more critical view of what they're trying to show with this subject matter. Again, whether it's a just war like the American Revolution to maybe one that's more critiqued like the Vietnam War and everything in between.
Well, one of the arguments I try to make in the book is that the only way any film works as an active learning tool is to have some sort of theoretical framework or scaffold against which you judge it. And so the one that I propose is called the just war doctrine. Just war doctrine has been around in some form or another for about 150 years. In fact, the real first formalized code of just war doctrine was 1863, what's called the Lieber Code, where Abraham Lincoln employed a Swiss-born judge named Franz Lieber to create a code of conduct, which was aimed originally at Confederate prisoners of war. After World War I, it was expanded into the United Nations Charter and the Geneva and Hague Conventions. And basically, it's the body of international law and treaties which have developed over the last 100 years, though its roots go all the way back to St. Thomas Aquinas and medieval philosophy. And the premise is that in order for a war to be moral, it has to be limited. And those limitations will allow for a moral course. For example, you can't start a war for unjust causes. You can't deliberately target civilians. You can't use means that are termed mala in se, which means evil in themselves. And the idea behind my book is that the just war doctrine becomes the framework that teachers can use for students to consider what the film is depicting, whether or not the film is depicting just war violations or just war doctrine being upheld, and why the filmmaker might make that choice.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And again, like I said, I think that's especially for this type of topic. I really did appreciate your theoretical framework to let teachers, kind of think about showing these films before they just dive right into these lesson plans and start teaching it. So I think that was a great benefit of your book. That again, maybe just a little bit different than some of the other books in the series. But talking about the different films that you selected. You when I asked you to let me know what you want to talk about in this podcast, you said you want to talk a little bit more about Saving Private Ryan and Glory, which we've already kind of discussed a bit. But can you talk a little bit more about why you selected those two films to look at in your book?
I think there are a lot of war films, and in the book I try to chart the history of war films, and I think that sometimes people don't realize that the film industry is really only about a century old. And so there's been a limited amount of time, but an enormous amount of output, particularly in times of warfare, World War I, World War II, all the way up through our current conflicts. There have been film depictions and filmed narrative about those events. Saving Private Ryan and Glory are probably the two most widely used in the K-12 curriculum, or I should say the 6-12 curriculum. If anybody in K-6 is using Saving Private Ryan, they probably got to rethink it pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would agree.
And yeah. That's not a good one for a fourth grade classroom.
Right.
Saving Private Ryan gets used probably more for one reason more than anything else, which is the opening 20 minutes. For people who have seen it, the beginning of the film is an incredibly graphic, brutal, and harrowing depiction of the D-Day invasion in Normandy in June of 1944. And it quickly after that turns into a very different kind of film. Instead of a historical depiction, it becomes a fictional narrative about one squad who is dispatched to rescue a soldier whose brothers have been killed in combat. And the army at the highest levels makes the decision that rather than risk this one soldier's life, he needs to be evacuated. The film got a lot of grief, despite its universal acclaim. It got a lot of grief academically for people who said that outside of that initial, really charged depiction of war and how brutal it is, the movie becomes a narrative about the heroism and bravery of these soldiers to rescue one of their own. And probably that criticism was not helped by what is a very treacly epilogue featuring, an aged veteran saluting a gravestone. I try to avoid spoilers here, even though the movie's 25 years old. It's
25 years. Spoil away.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the standard is for that.
Just a disclaimer: if you haven't seen Saving Private Ryan, watch it before. We talked
pause
about
here,
the
watch it, and come back.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
But having watched it a bunch of times, and what's most interesting about it is that I think it might be the most subversively anti-war film ever made. The central mission of these soldiers to rescue Private Ryan is questioned multiple times by the soldiers themselves. What is the point of this? Why are we being asked to risk our lives for this one guy? And the backdrop, the immensity of the war, this is a very strange mission to go on to rescue one person. And it does feel like a surreal risk of their lives. There's frequently moments in the film where they're confronted with the fact that this is possibly a suicide mission, and maybe even probably a suicide mission. So why are we doing it? There's a movie from 1957 by Stanley Kubrick called Paths of Glory, which is meant to show the absolute banality of war as men are ordered into combat to satisfy one officer's ego. And what's strange is Saving Private Ryan is the flip side of that. It's men being sent to their deaths out of what is portrayed as a sense of selflessness, but not by the people who came up with the idea. The ones who have to do it are really cynical about the whole enterprise from start to finish. And of course, the ending of the film, again, no spoilers, but it ends with a really, really dark, almost absurd twist where one character is left to carry the guilt of this event for 60 years. And it certainly doesn't appear as if he's dealt with it well. So I've always been struck by how that film is really, really, really subtle in the way it depicts war, and war as ultimately almost a satirically comical event. Glory is, I think, without doubt, the most widely used film. You walk into any school, any high school in America, sooner or later you're going to find somebody in a history class showing Glory. It's an excellent film. It's a film that depicts a story that is not widely told. It's incredibly well acted. What was very interesting in the film to me is the way just war doctrine is displayed in the film and the reactions of the characters in it. Most notably, there's a scene where the white officer in charge, Robert Gould Shaw, informs his troops, his all-black troops, that the Confederate government had decided to not treat seized black soldiers as captives or prisoners of war, but instead that they would be returned to a state of slavery. And if they were freed blacks, they would be enslaved. That also meant that white officers taken in command of black troops would be deemed as inciting insurrection and would be summarily shot without trial. That was a massive violation of just war doctrine. And that's one reason why the Union decided to stop exchanging prisoners during the war. That depiction, plus the movie's depiction of a Union raid on Darien, Georgia, where Union troops set fire to buildings and killed civilians, is not only pretty historically accurate, but confronts students with, the idea of just war doctrine. If the war ends more quickly because we do things beyond the pale, does that make them moral? And so even today, now 30, 40 years after the making of Glory, it really asks those questions in very sensitive and critical ways.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And again, I certainly agree that these are definitely films that are often used. I remember when I was a school teacher teaching 8th grade Georgia studies, we actually had a edited version of Glory so we could show our 8th graders some of the movie. And I think that was done by somebody, because I know we had every school that I knew had a copy of that edited version of Glory. And again, yeah, and just the visuals of both movies are just breathtaking. I'll never forget the fight scene with I can't remember the actor's name, Adam something, where he had
Adam Goldberg,
yeah, who had a knife fight with a German Nazi, a soldier that was just gritty and raw and painful to watch, and it just really kind of hit you,
Yeah.
showing you how violent war can be with those two men fighting each other for
There's
their lives.
there's little things like that
Yeah.
all throughout the film, which
Yeah.
upon rewatching, in that scene where Adam Goldberg's character is involved, you said, in this incredibly visceral knife fight.
Mhm.
There's the character of Upham. Upham is a translator and a typist who is more or less dragooned into this mission
Mhm.
because they need someone who can speak German. He is small. He is academic and bookish. He tries to be friendly with these soldiers who are quite hardened, who mock him for it. During the battle, the big culminating battle, he's running back and forth, providing ammunition to the various areas. When he goes up the stairs trying to help Adam Goldberg's character, he's frozen by fear, and he can't proceed. And that is an incredibly touching and in many ways infuriating scene, because as viewers of the film, you're like, just go up the stairs, help him. Especially as experienced consumers of media, we expect that, okay, here comes Upham to the rescue. At the very end of the movie, again, no spoilers, Upham is confronted by a German soldier who he helped engineer the release of early in the film. And the German soldier says in German, "I know this man, Upham." And then Upham kills him.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really fascinating about the movie is the movie depicting Upham now as having traversed over from cowardice to bravery? Are we depicting him as now accepting the hardened realities of war, that, killing an unarmed soldier, one who has surrendered, is morally acceptable? And what's really, really interesting about the film is the way it takes those things overlaid alongside incredibly stark violence, like you described with Adam Goldberg's character, and forces viewers to go, wait, is this the right thing I'm watching? Is what I'm watching here, should this be happening? Particularly because in the film, when they finally find Private Ryan, his first reaction is, I'm not going. I'm not going to abandon my comrades. So the film really turns a lot of traditional wartime tropes on its head.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. Well, great. Well, thank you for that discussion about war films in general and why you selected Saving Private Ryan and Glory. And now what we do with the podcast is we kind of talk about the different steps in the Hollywood or history strategy, where we go through selecting sources and that kind of thing. So we'll do the same thing. Like I said, even though your book's a little bit different, you certainly have lesson plans that you developed that a teacher could use. So but we'll talk a little bit more about the different steps in the process. So step one is selecting. You have to select the state standards and the film clips that you want to use that correlate well to those state standards. So could you talk a little bit more about for your lessons that you're going to discuss? Can you talk a little bit more about the standards that you selected?
Sure. I looked at the standards of New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, all area states. Most of the standards are pretty similar in terms of what they allow. I always tell my students that standards are not a laundry list of things to be taught, but essentially justification to teach the things you choose. And pretty much every state in America will include in their standards instruction related to the conflicts we fought, particularly the Civil War and World War II. So finding institutional cover to teach these things is not hard, and finding standards that allow it is not hard. When it came to sources for the two films in question, Saving Private Ryan and Glory, Saving Private Ryan's story is a fictional one, but it's inspired by a couple of true stories. At one point in the movie, they feature a character, George Marshall, quoting from what's called the Bixby Letter, which is a letter that in 1863 Abraham Lincoln wrote to a Mrs. Bixby who had ostensibly lost 6 of her sons in combat. As it turned out, 4 had died in combat, 1 had been imprisoned, and the 6th had actually deserted. But nobody knew that at the time. It also referenced 2 events from World War II where brothers had been stationed together on naval ships, and both of those ships had been sunk and all of them had been killed. So it became policy in World War II to try to avoid stationing brothers together. So one of the resources I wanted students to use was not only the Bixby Letter, but also the manner in which the fighting Sullivans, the brothers who had been killed on board the USS Belleau, were used, I don't want to overstate it, but for propagandist purpose, to justify their deaths, to avenge their deaths. For Glory, there's actually a fair number of primary documents connected to the events depicted there, primarily because of the letters of Robert Gould Shaw. Robert Gould Shaw was the 25-year-old colonel who was from a prominent Boston abolitionist family. He was promoted to take over this regiment, and in his letters home and in his diary, he not only depicts the events that occurred to his regiment, but also his own doubts about the mission, about his own ability to lead. And it's his letter to his wife that describes the raid on Darien, which is depicted in the film.
Yeah, great. And again, just a disclaimer to our teacher listeners, we really focus in the book series on making sure that every lesson meets the requirement of state standards. Obviously, we try to have a variety of state standards in each of our lesson plans, red state, blue state, purple state, whatever states. And again, that does provide you, as Mark said, with some cover when it comes to depicting these, difficult topics. And again, I think, even though this is going to be more based for secondary folks, it doesn't hurt, especially with these war films, to get some administrator approval. Let them know what you're doing, show them the clips that you plan to use, let them take a look at the primary sources. Because even if you're working with seniors in high school, we lived in a very litigious age where you just may want to get a little bit more approval. Like I said, we obviously support the use of this type of inquiry, but I do think that especially with the sensitive subject matter of war films, that we just want to reiterate the steps that you may want to take as a teacher before you do this.
Yeah, I actually joke with my students all the time that teachers should be the world's worst magicians. Magicians never give away the trick. We always should. You should be totally upfront about what you're doing, why you're doing it, when you're doing it. The students should know if the film is particularly contentious. Parents should know. I would show Schindler's List nearly every year, and it would always be prefaced by not only permission slips, but letters home to the parents to explain what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. There is an element of surprise that any filmmaker and film goer expects, but when they're used for educational purposes, it's a bad idea to try to bushwhack kids. You're running the risk of the shock value of the material you're using being too overwhelming and diluting the reason you want them to see the film. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. For every teacher who wants to use war films, don't hide your light under a bushel. Make sure people know in advance what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Right. The last thing we want you to do is to be on the front page of the, New Jersey Times or the Michigan Times because you did this
or any paper.
Yeah, exactly. So again, but I do think that, permission slips, administration, that kind of thing. Again, not necessarily for all the lessons in the series because, as we talked about with the elementary, I think Ivan the movie about Ivan the gorilla is probably okay. But when it comes to this type of subject matter, you definitely want to be sensitive to the needs of your students and of course their parents as well. So the next step in the Hollywood history is to develop a interesting question. The good thing about the book series is you already have one compelling question, Hollywood or history. Hollywood meaning like everything about this movie is not accurate. It's fake. There's nothing that you can use as far as a historian or social scientist that that really means that this movie should be used. On the other hand, we have the history, meaning everything about this movie is accurate. It's like you went back in time and you're watching D-Day, during Saving Private Ryan, or obviously somewhere in between. So that is the compelling question we have. But every author with their lesson plan also writes some secondary questions to help lead the process of that lesson plan. So can you tell us a little bit more about your supporting questions that you wrote for those lessons about glory and Saving Private Ryan?
Sure. For Saving Private Ryan, I was very interested in the question of, is it pro-war or is it not? I think that the initial viewing of that film would leave you believing, oh, sure, yeah, these guys were heroes. They, laid down their lives to save someone else. But upon repeated viewing or with proper and careful framing, you do know the question of if it's possible that this movie is depicting war in any cause to be utterly absurd. Both movies, Saving Private Ryan and Glory, do also focus on the question of sacrifice. And when is sacrifice justifiable? When is it okay? When is it permissible? Is there such a thing as a life being lost in a worthy cause? Glory in particular is interesting because at no point, so far as I can tell, in the movie do they say the word glory anywhere. You're meant, I think, at the end to take away the idea that these men fought and died bravely and their names will be memorialized. But most intriguingly, and this is a matter of historical record, so I don't think it's much of a spoiler, the culminating battle at the end of the film is a failure. They don't achieve their objectives, and many, many lives are lost for taking of a fortress that ultimately is never taken. So as a result, the question being asked is, are the sacrifice being made at that time and through our history worthwhile? Also in Glory, I was really fascinated with the depiction of the burning of Darien, Georgia. The colonel in charge of the the contraband troops that set fire in Darien, is portrayed in the movie as kind of a religious fanatic and vaguely anti-Semitic and pretty loathsome. What's interesting is that the real character was a committed abolitionist who truly believed that the way to defeat the South was to not only destroy their infrastructure, but also to apply what William Sherman did in Georgia. He said, I propose to give the South a beating they will remember for generations. The movie, though, depicts Shaw's stand against the burning as a principled, adherence to moral codes, and the colonel in charge as a war criminal. So it's a really fascinating question for kids to think about, especially in the way William Sherman is traditionally depicted in our classrooms as doing the callous but tough, the regrettable but necessary tactic in his march to the sea and his move towards total war. This guy, maybe just ahead of the curve, who knows? Right. So I thought the supporting questions, particularly in these movies, were really compelling in the way they could provide teachers opportunity to frame effective inquiry.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you talk about Sherman. The first article that I ever published about Hollywood history was about the film Gone with the Wind and Sherman's attack on Atlanta. And again, me being a native Georgian, I had always heard that Sherman was the bad guy. He burned Atlanta. His name's a curse word. There's a show called Georgia Stories from PBS that we used to show our students, and they said, yeah, Sherman's name will always be a curse word in Georgia. And I'm like, well, this is getting a little too much. I think Sherman had a purpose. There had to be something that was his motivation for burning Atlanta, and I want my students to get both sides, right, or both perspectives, or multiple perspectives about this. So I actually wrote the first Hollywood history lesson plan about that scene in Gone with the Wind, where it looks like Sherman attacks just out of the blue and they weren't ready for it, even though in actuality, Sherman had given a letter to the mayor of Atlanta a month and a half prior to the burning saying, get rid of the civilians. We're gonna burn this down because of the military equipment you have there, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very interesting. And then again, I was just in Darien a few months ago when my father passed away. I moved him down to Brunswick, Georgia. Darien's nearby, and I went on a tour of Fort King George, which is one of the earliest forts in what is now Georgia, even before there was a Georgia. And I remembered this scene in Glory, and I wanted to see if there was anything depicting that burning of Darien. I found one state marker on the side of the road that talked about it. That was it.
Wow.
So so it's very, so any Georgia teachers who are listening to this, if you live around Darien, you may want to definitely use this scene and see if your students can take action later on to describe this event in more detail based on what they saw in the movie and the primary and secondary sources that Mark has selected.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just going on to selecting the sources, you did talk a little bit about your primary and secondary sources already. But again, when we do a Hollywood history, you definitely want to select primary and secondary sources that students can use in order to determine the answer to the question, Hollywood history. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the sources that you selected for those teachers that may be interested in doing something like this?
Sure. For Glory, I relied pretty heavily on the Bixby letter, and for Saving Private Ryan, I used a similar letter from Franklin Roosevelt, who wrote a letter in 1943 to Aletta Sullivan, who was the mother of the four brothers killed on the SS Bello. In both of those, it represents, and I don't think it's a smear on FDR to say that Lincoln's letter is maybe a little more lyrical and poetic, but both of them represent condolences for how their children were sacrificed on what Lincoln calls the altar of liberty. And that's a really compelling way to talk about this idea of sacrifice, that, should the loss of these children be considered a necessary sacrifice for the defense of the nation? Or is this a needless and really, really bleak, tragic event? Secondary sources, particularly Saving Private Ryan, I relied on a couple of articles which tried to illustrate what I talked about during this interview, the profound contradiction at the heart of Saving Private Ryan. The idea that the attempt to save one life incurs the death of dozens for this singular mission in a war that costs millions. And it really does focus on what is a single life like. So one particularly great article by David Sims from the Atlantic Monthly, another one by Jay Bingvetz, who was talking about the grimness of Saving Private Ryan, and how what's interesting in the case of Saving Private Ryan particularly, and maybe even Glory, there's very little chance for any of these characters to redirect what's going to happen to them. In Glory, there's a scene right before the climactic battle scene where it's more or less a revival sing-along, and most of the characters seem to have pretty quietly accepted the likelihood they're going to die on the next day. In Saving Private Ryan, there's really no opportunity outside of a few rather meek criticisms to escape that final battle. There's very little talk about the tactics involved, the strategy involved. Instead, it's really more about, we can't leave. We must stay here. And in fact, one of the characters invokes the title of the movie by saying, maybe Saving Private Ryan is the only good thing we've done in this war. And so the secondary sources I use try really to look hard at that question at the heart of this movie. It is an unusual film that questions the moral supremacy of World War II, which in our narrative has traditionally and consistently been depicted as a good war, a war that needed fighting. So again, I give Steven Spielberg a lot of credit for taking on a subject like that and really, really, really being subtle in the way he approached it.
Great. Yeah. And like I said, these are definitely well-known films. And I think, most of our viewers have seen it. And if you haven't seen it, then definitely, like we said, stop the a couple minutes ago and take a look. So the next step, obviously, is the developing of the graphic organizer. We had a standard graphic organizer that we use in all of the books, courtesy of our last publisher, that helped students do the analysis of the primary, secondary sources as well as the film. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the primary source the graphic organizer that you used, and did you make any changes, alterations to that, or have any other ideas for graphic organizer for these films?
In fact, I changed very little, and I think that's a testament to how strong the graphic organizer is. When I talk to my classes, we talk eventually about the Venn diagram, and I say, what is the purpose of a Venn diagram? They all say it's compare and contrast. And I say, there's a reason you can't reinvent the Venn diagram. It's perfect for what it's trying to do. And I think the graphic organizer that Hollywood and History has used in previous volumes is just really effective because it allows a teacher not only to conduct inquiry with the film itself, but also to focus on the compelling question you described at the outset, which is Hollywood or history. Is this BS or is this accurate? What's really, really interesting about film, especially depictions of war, is we all accept that it's not going to be accurate, that there's always things you have to change. How close can you get? I'd be really fascinated to see future volumes talking about the movie Oppenheimer. When I first saw the movie Oppenheimer, I got genuinely alarmed on behalf of teachers. I'm like, this is just too dense. Christopher Nolan assumes quite a lot about the Manhattan Project, doesn't pull any punches, doesn't explain who many characters are, doesn't dumb anything down, and effectively bookends the entire movie with a pair of Senate hearings, which is not what you'd call, like traditional mythic cinema. And yet it's gripping. And yet it's incredibly well made. And it does do a lot of what these movies do, which is focus on big moral questions. So I think the graphic organizer in use here can be effective for any film analysis because it allows teachers to not only pick and choose their battles in the primary and secondary sources, but also to focus on those big questions that any movie should have to endure. Hollywood or history. Is this useful or not useful?
Yeah, and I think my other question would be, I wonder which comes first, Oppenheimer or Barbie. We'll see. We'll see the next volume of what we can do. So, well, great. Well, after we find the state standards that we're going to use, we find the primary and secondary sources, we use the graphic organizer, either one that we created for Hollywood History or one that you adapt. Then you finally get to show the film, right, to your students. And I was just wondering, you talked a little bit about it already with your lessons about Saving Private Ryan and Glory. Do you recall any specific scenes that you would want teachers to show their students based on your work?
I am always a huge fan in Saving Private Ryan of the issue of what's called Steamboat Willie. There's a scene where the squad on their way to the town of Ramel, where they think Private Ryan is going to be, they come across a machine gun nest, a German machine gun nest. The officer in charge, Tom Hanks's character, Captain Miller, insists that they take out this machine gun nest because it could be, it could attack soldiers that follow them. The squad's reluctant; they don't want to do it. They all have a bad feeling about it, and the resulting attack, their medic is killed, Wade, and it's incredibly traumatic, obviously, for the entire group. They capture one German, and most of the soldiers want to execute him, and the only one who doesn't want to execute him is Upham. And Upham tries to intercede. The captain is, to the men, mute, stoic. He excuses himself from the action and has a really traumatic emotional breakdown over the loss of Wade and his own culpability in it. And when he returns, the squad is fractured. Some of them want to kill him. Some of them want to abandon the entire mission. He retrieves them, in effect, by talking about his own personal background, which had been quite a mystery for most of the men. And he said something to one of the soldiers, that every man I kill, I feel farther away from home. And that idea of, if you do release this person, this soldier, it is likely he will rejoin the German army at some point. It's likely you might see him again. He's going to be in the same area. And in fact, at the end of the movie, again, spoiler for everyone who hasn't seen it, Tom Hanks's character is shot and ultimately killed by this soldier who had been set free by Upham. The movie doesn't really answer questions about whether or not this is justifiable. Upham's point that he is a prisoner who has surrendered and should be treated benevolently, that's in line with most international laws and treaties. Students, when I showed that film, are fanatically divided about this issue, about what should be done with the character known as Steamboat Willie, especially given the fact that ultimately at the end, he does return and he does kill a beloved character. In Glory, there are multiple scenes. One of the ones I really, really love is where Colonel Shaw is informing his men of this Confederate proclamation that if captured, they will not be treated like POWs. And then the following day, expecting many desertions, he sees that there are none, that the men have stayed. It's an incredibly dramatic and thrilling moment in the movie, and it's also accurate, which, that's one of the great benefits of that film, that the stuff that sometimes is really the most hard to believe is the stuff that's true. Probably the least accurate thing in the film, it depicts the character of Denzel Washington being flogged. For allegedly trying to desert, when in fact he wasn't deserting. He was trying to find a pair of shoes that would fit.
A very famous scene with a tear coming down his eye, and
my goodness, that's an Oscar
winner. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And he's stunning throughout that film. He's amazing. Flogging had been banned in the Union Army by 1863, so that didn't happen. I understand the dramatic choices for it, but it's interesting to have kids watch that scene and then question its historical authenticity and wonder whether or not the filmmaker made the right choice or not. In terms of acclaim, in terms of legacy, in terms of awards that Denzel Washington won, he certainly made the right choice. It's not historically accurate, but it is immensely powerful. So that's another scene that for students is always a real attention getter, and they are riveted by it.
Yeah, definitely. So after you show the film clips, right, we want our students to start the analysis. So the first thing that we recommend is step 6, analyzing the secondary source. You've already mentioned your secondary sources for both film, but is there any tips or tricks you want to give to our teacher listeners about using these secondary sources for this particular analysis?
The secondary sources and primary sources, depending upon their age, have usually the same problem for students, which is sometimes tough to navigate. The articles I picked were written by they're written in more mainstream journalistic publications. They were not academically written, although the writers themselves are academics. So the writing's a little easier to navigate for kids. Primary documents, the older they are, the tougher they are for students. They really have trouble with the rhetoric of prior generations, and the farther back you go, the more dense and flowery that rhetoric gets. So for any reading you give kids, careful scaffolding is important. Guided reading, depending upon the level of learner that you're working with and the age of the student, is a great idea. Helping them try to unpack the meaning of these sources rather than allowing them to kind of flail on their own with them is essential. I think the sources used in this particular lesson are either A, stripped down enough that kids can follow them, or B, visual in nature, as with the poster of the Fighting Sullivans. So it allows them to interpret without getting caught up in the language. But for any source that you use, especially in a socialized classroom, you really got to be conscious about how kids are going to be interpreting them or what roadblocks they may run into in reading them.
Right. Yep. And definitely as well as the primary source, which is step 7. But Sam Weinberg, historian, teacher, educator out of University of Stanford, says that if you do use a primary source and you need to change the language to meet the reading needs of your students, that's certainly okay to do. Just make sure that you have the actual primary source either on the back or attached to that revised source to make sure it actually stays a primary source. And, any teacher knows that you have some kids that want to read the actual primary source. Some kids are just fine with the, the changed edition just for their reading ability or somewhere in between. So you definitely do that as well. So step 8 is where we do the Hollywood or history. And as I remind the listeners and the viewers several times, this is where the students are supposed to come up with their own conclusions based on the evidence from the primary and secondary source about how accurate the film clip is and how to answer those compelling and supporting questions that are discussed in the lesson plan. So we won't dive into that now because I definitely want your opinion about these films, Mark, in a second. But you certainly I want to remind teachers that, again, as a teacher, you should be a facilitator with Hollywood or history. You should not be the sage on the stage, if you will. And we really, when you get to that point, you want your students to be able to come up with their own conclusions based on evidence. Then what we do is we do at the end some sort of conclusion, which is step number 9 in the C3 framework. That's dimension 4 called taking action. So Mark, can you talk a little bit more about your concluding activities that you had in these 2 lessons about Saving Private Ryan and Glory?
Well, one of the big questions we ask is the central question of the series, which is, how accurate is this, and how much does that matter? I think particularly of Schindler's List, where it's a story that is rooted in a real story, but the film is incredibly stripped down, and it's such a complex story in real life. But you can see why the filmmaker had to make that choice. You could not have depicted the event as it really happened. Saving Private Ryan is fictional. The events against which the action had happened is fictional. So that's not accurate. But is that a problem? Does that present for students a roadblock? And what's interesting for most film use in classrooms is that students are just expected to passively receive it as a depiction of a historical event, but not something they're meant to actively criticize. And so I often find when we use film in the classroom this way, that students find it quite refreshing when they get to say things about the film. I like that. I didn't like that. I don't understand this choice. I do understand that choice. For Glory is a film that is depicting a true story and includes many historically accurate characters, but does so with a particular goal in mind. And what's asking kids is, what is that goal? The veneration of these men, the elevation of them to heroic status after decades of neglect. What if, for example, a film version of this event was made by Southerners, which in effect it was in Birth of a Nation in 1915. So it's fascinating to let them play with those perspectives. And really what's interesting for me with students culminating the use of these films is, what is the purpose of the teacher in using these things? To ask kids directly, why did I show you this? Am I showing this to show you what the Civil War looked like, what people wore, how they talked? Sure. Okay. That's part of it. That's great. Am I trying to show you this to say the war was justified, that the war wasn't justified, that what we've done in our past was good or bad, or is that immaterial? And allowing kids to actively grapple with the narrative and what it's being presented to them for, I think, is the ultimate value of film, because films are by their nature extremely engaging, but they also do require you to kind of sit back and watch and receive what the film is telling you. Making kids question it actively at the end is really essential, and I think really, really, really useful.
Excellent. So, Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot. So, again, we'll tell our teachers, again, our listeners and viewers, we want the kids to make these decisions based on evidence. But since you are the expert on both Glory and Saving Private Ryan, and we may have listeners who are not teachers, they just may be interested in the accuracy of these films because they just typed into their Google search and they saw this because we talked about Saving Private Ryan. So for those listeners, can you talk about how accurate, using that continuum, 100% Hollywood, 100% history, or somewhere in between, how accurate would you say those scenes that you use in Glory are?
In Glory, they're pretty accurate. They're not bad. And that's, I think, if 100% historical accuracy, I don't know, is achievable even in a documentary, because people are making choices about what to show and what not to show. probably the closest, and this is not a war film, but the documentary about the Beatles, Get Back, that was produced last year for Apple Plus, is about as accurate as you can get, because A, it's unedited footage for the most part, and B, it's really long. I mean, so they showed everything these guys were doing. To show an accurate version of the attack on Fort Wagner at the end of Glory would be difficult to do. So there are obviously some touches that are inaccurate, but the way in which the battle proceeded, the way in which the battle moved into the nighttime, the way in which at the end of the battle, the soldiers' bodies were disposed of, all of that is accurate. In fact, many of the scenes that are accurate are portrayed in a melodramatic fashion to increase viewer engagement, but it's not that they're wrong. So I would say, generally speaking, Glory does pretty well. The only catch is that the four main characters, the black soldiers, are all fictional. They are all synthesized versions of real characters in some cases. This does present some racial elements that are worth exploring as well. The 54th Massachusetts, being the first all-black volunteer regiment, was placed under the command of white officers. That was a condition of Congress establishing the rules for black service in the war. There's little mention of that. There's some overt racism displayed by white officers here and there, but the role of white commanders in the 54th is largely portrayed as an issue of benevolent guidance, rather than, in some cases, white officers who were not committed to the cause. So that's an element that is kind of unexplored, but I wouldn't necessarily call it inaccurate.
Didn't Frederick Douglass wasn't a couple of his children or one of his children, sons?
Both of his sons.
Both his sons were in that unit, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And they have an uncredited appearance by Frederick Douglass at the outset, which, again, it's nice they include it. It does kind of elide the fact that he was really central to the creation of this regiment. But that's my PhD dissertation was about textbooks. And the number one complaint about textbooks is, well, we need to add more stuff. And that, of course, then becomes self-defeating, because a textbook then just gets bigger and longer and more boring. With film, yeah, we could have another 18-minute scene about how important Frederick Douglass was, to the creation of the 54th, but now the movie's 3 hours long. So I recognize, and students do too, that filmmakers make choices, and sometimes that, minimizes the role somebody might have.
And listeners, be on the lookout. 2 of the upcoming Hollywood history volumes will be about documentaries, American history documentaries and world history documentaries. So that will be over the next 4 or 5 years, but they will be coming at some point. So and my dissertation was also about textbook analysis. So I guess we've moved from textbooks on to movies.
That's right. We made some bad choices somewhere.
Exactly. So what about you said Saving Private Ryan is based as a fictional story, historical fiction based on real events, D-Day, that kind of thing. So using that same continuum, what do you think about the scenes that you're using in Saving Private Ryan?
Well, by and large, Saving Private Ryan, even the parts that are fictional, are very authentic in terms of the combat. In fact, that's its calling card. The opening sequence at Omaha Beach shows just how chaotic and disorganized it was, how close to failure it was as compared to the other landing sectors during D-Day. It shows the absolute brutality of this war. It also shows, in many cases, I think, the degree to which soldiers in that war became hardened or desensitized to the violence they were perpetrating. This is 1944. So at this point, the U.S. has been at war for 3 years. One of the main characters, Sergeant Horvath, is seen carrying tins of dirt that he's picked up at various places during the war. And that's meant to indicate his long service, through which Tom Hanks's character, Captain Miller, has been alongside him. There's a scene, and it's not one I've shown in class, but it's one that I was always fascinated with. During the D-Day invasion, there's a moment where 2 German soldiers, try to surrender, and they raise their hand. They begin speaking in a language that the American soldiers can understand. The American soldiers shoot them down. One of the soldiers says, "What do you think he was saying?" And the second soldier holds up his hands and says, "Look, I washed for supper." And they both laugh. What's most fascinating in that scene, and there's no way to know this without finding out later, is that these 2 soldiers were not speaking German. They were speaking Czech. And they were saying, "Don't shoot me, I'm Czech, I'm not German." They were wearing SS uniforms, though. And this really did happen, that the SS had dragooned many Czech soldiers into fighting on the Western Front. Now, were these soldiers lying? Were they pretending to be Czech and hoping that the Americans would figure it out? Were they genuinely Czech soldiers who were then gunned down, not only without cause, but erroneously by American soldiers. That is a really, really, really subtle and inside baseball piece of filmmaking right there. And in that case, it's accurate, it's authentic without being necessarily accurate. So I seek Saving Private Ryan for the almost the atmosphere of the film, more than the historical detail or historical accuracy is important.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So, listeners, on the PowerPoint that you can access through the show notes, you will have some of the references and materials that Mark discussed in the episode. And now, finally, Mark, anything to promote? I know you're also a podcaster, so you definitely want to talk about that. But tell the audience more about your podcast, as well as any work you may have out now or upcoming.
Well, yeah, the podcast is called Pod Save the Teachers. It's available for download on our student radio station Spotlight or wherever you get your podcasts on 1077 The Bronx, 1077thebronx.com. That's BRONC, The Bronx, because we're the home of the Bronx. However, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Overplay, all of them, you can find it. It's a monthly podcast where we explore issues related to education, both in New Jersey and across the country. We just had an episode where we focused on smartphone use and the impact it's having on students. Spoiler alert, it's not great. The impact that is, the episode I think is pretty good. And yeah, we've been doing it for a couple of years. It's great fun. We'd love to have you on, by the way, to talk about your work.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so we can be reciprocal about this.
Perfect. I'll look forward to it. Any other books or articles that you've published recently, or?
I'm working on a chapter in a book right now on this one's going to probably get me in trouble, on Native American nations who collaborated with the United States during westward expansion. I was interested in the way that Native Americans are portrayed, primarily either as submissive captives of white expansion or proud, defiant warriors in opposition to it. But what about those tribes that worked with the U.S. government? What about the Kiowa that decided that the enemy of the enemy is their friend? And I was really interested in that idea. And so I'm working on a book chapter with a series of other authors on that one. And that's been really, really compelling, really interesting stuff.
Awesome. And hopefully when I do get that call out, you'll be contributing to our American history documentary volume.
Absolutely.
Again,
yeah.
definitely.
I appreciate the invite. These are always great projects to work on.
Yeah, it'll be hopefully we have a new publisher, as the listeners know, Emerald Publishing. So I'm working with them and going through the process of figuring out a new publisher. Super excited about Emerald and what they bring to the series. And that will definitely be the American history documentary will be my first contribution to Emerald, even though we have a couple of other books coming out early through Emerald after that, the buyout. So looking forward to that. So listeners, if you have any questions about for me or Mark based on his book, please don't forget you can email us at HollywoodOrHistoryPodcast@gmail.com. Once again, any questions that you have for me or Mark about the book about war films, again, please contact us at HollywoodOrHistoryPodcast@gmail.com. Thank you very much, Mark, for being here. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Take care now.
Hollywood History volumes are now published by Emerald Publishing out of the UK. All volumes can be purchased on Emerald's website or anywhere books are sold. If the innovative ideas discussed in the podcast have led you or a family member to consider earning an undergraduate or graduate degree in education from Central Michigan University, we encourage you to review the links in the show notes or contact host Dr. Scott Roberts at rober4s@cmich.edu. We offer undergraduate degrees in general and special education at the elementary level, secondary disciplines including social studies, and graduate degrees in curriculum and instruction, instructional technology, literacy, health and PE, and special education. We also have accelerated teacher certification programs for those with undergraduate degrees in something other than education who want to become excellent teachers in the state of Michigan.